Hi, Steve Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller here. And yes, we're still fighting off the last vestiges of COVID, so which is probably why I look dreadful, but there you go. But you know, at my age, you look dreadful anyway. And I thought it was time to sort of read some contemporary SF and patch myself back into the mainstream, as painful as that is, because I have sort of made it fairly clear that I'm not really that enamoured of what's happening in the genre right now, even though I am concerned about the genre being under threat from the huge amount of YA romance fantasy that's creeping over into publishers' budgets. So, you know, maybe it's time to sort of, have a look at what's happening with the skiffy and try and give you some recommendations. So originally, I thought I'd read 5 contemporary SF novels or collections or what have you, and sort of do a review of 5, and then I just found the idea of 5 too painful, so I did 4 books in a row, read 4 books in a row, and it was quite an enjoyable process. Then I picked up Hal Clement's Mission of Gravity, which is an old book which I haven't read for a long time, and I read it first probably in the 80s, and it is a bit of a sort of a classic. It looks like this. And it's funny because there's a blurb on the back on the current Masterworks edition. I had to buy a new edition because my old one had long gone. And Thomas M. Dish says, sort of finest story of sort of, alien sort of contact, what have you. And, and it's like a children's book. It's not really very well written or anything. There's some good ideas, but they're not very well articulated. I'm sure a lot of people will hate me for saying this. I don't really think that it's the classic it's built up to be, really. But anyway, that sort of took me off tack, and then I ended up going down the whole Midwich Cuckoo's rabbit hole again. But so I decided to stick with 4 because I thought there was quite enough for one video. And I want to begin with the least of the books I read, the least impressive, which is John Scalzi's The Keiju Preservation Society from Tor. Now, of course, I'm sure you know what a keiju is. It's a large sort of Japanese monster from a large Japanese monster movie, The cage has never entirely gone away. It's pretty much always been with us. There's been times when it wasn't around, and there's numerous Godzilla films, and there's things like Gamera, which is from a different studio and what have you. And I remember a few years ago I was quite impressed by this version of Godzilla, which is the one directed by the chap who did Monsters, which has some poetry in it. And I want to talk about science fiction and poetry later on. And I rewatched this the other night, and I must have been inebriated the first time I saw it, because it's a bit of a big dumb movie. The best part is a lot of the time it's Godzilla's in the dark. It's just got an air of mystery. So it's a little bit Cloverfield, I suppose. But I'm really wondering why I've got this in the collection. But it is what it is. When I was a kid, of course, I used to read about these things. It's very hard to get to see the Toho films. So you years later, you sort of develop this thing where you must see everything you wanted to see as a kid. And a little while ago I bought this limited edition of Mothra because Hugh Cornwell from the Stranglers did an instrumental called Mothra. Instrumental with singing on it, funny enough, and it's very pretty from Eureka, but it's a silly film. They're mostly terrible. They're quite dull, actually. You watch them as an adult, it's rather like the Jerry Anderson things. They're really boring. There's just odd moments which are great. My favourite Godzilla film, I know this is supposed to be books, but we've sort of veered off, so why not? Is this one, the Matthew Broderick one, which a lot of people hate? I've got the Toho original, I've got the uncut one, I've seen it, blah blah blah. And it's good, it's serious, what have you. But the one I enjoy the most is this one, and I guess this is my popcorn movie. I don't have many popcorn movies, really. I tend to prefer serious stuff, but I like this. I like the wit, I like the characters. I actually like Godzilla in it. I think there's a certain amount of sympathy in it when poor old Godzilla bites the dust, so I like that one. One of my other popcorn movies, wow, that would be telling, wouldn't it? From Dusk Till Dawn, Clueless. Shocking, isn't it? Or even somebody like Cronenberg, Argento, Leone, and, greats like that. To have these things in the canon, shocking, really. So anyway, going back to John Scalzi. The basic idea of this is that it's about a chap who's loses his job at the beginning of COVID, and he's quite sort of naive and overrates himself, and he goes in for a performance review with his CEO, who is the obvious villain of this, and he pops up throughout, and you can see it coming. It's the most blatant thing. he ends up sort of delivering food, bumps into somebody he knew at college, and he gets offered this job with the Kaiju Preservation Society. And the basic idea is that there's an alternate Earth where, you know, giant Japanese monsters, so they don't have to be Japanese, but we think of them as Japanese. Kaiju is a Japanese word. And, you know, they're there, and basically they live off atomic energy, and there's this sort of narrow gap between the worlds. The rift is caused by the sort of nuclear sort of aspect of the creatures' lifestyles and what have you. And I mean, what's the most disappointing about this is the visual sense, is that in no time does Scalzi really sort of describe the Kaijus of the world visually very well. And, you know, it's sort of very weak, and that's a weak thing in a lot of contemporary writing. Everybody seems afraid to commit to visual descriptions, probably because they're afraid that they can't write them very well, because, you know, sometimes they get too purple and too long. Scalzi himself did say he was writing some more serious books than this, but he got bogged down and had various issues and decided he needed to write a pop song, and this is a pop song. It's got snappy dialogue, which is irritating at times. You know, sometimes it's okay. One part of me thinks he's written this to try and get a film deal. It would work as a film. It'd work as a kind of mindless thing, rather like typical Kaiju films do. There's not a huge amount of subtext in it. The characters are mostly lines of dialogue rather than well-drawn individuals. They're just names and jokes. And, you know, it's okay, but, you know, I bought it on a whim, really. It came in a box. I was unpacking books at the back door of the shop, and this was in it. And I thought, well, I've not read Scalzi. I've never been drawn to him. His titles are rather dull. And, you know, I haven't really changed my mind. And, you know, it's okay, but it's kind of entry level, really. So if you like that sort of entry level stuff, you know, it's a pretty book, obviously, but if you want a sort of, you know, a monster book, you're okay. But so it's an odd one for me, and it probably says more about my state of mind at that time, that I thought I'd give it a try. Well, at least I've done something, stepped up my comfort zone, and sort of confirmed my own prejudices. This isn't really that great, you know. Some of my friends have liked it, but I thought it was sort of quite average, really. But as he says himself, it wasn't meant to be a massively ambitious book, which is fine. Next up in ranked order of quality was this, Atlas Alone by Emma Newman. I didn't read them in this order, by the way. I read them in a completely different order. But this is the fourth in Emma's tetralogy, the Planet 4 tetralogy. It's not a quadrilogy. Quadrilogy is a word invented by somebody in Hollywood who doesn't understand books. It's always been tetralogy. You might get away with quartet, but trilogy, tetralogy, that's the way it goes. Okay, so it's 4 volumes. And she does say that on her website that she wanted to write more of these, but the publishing support wasn't there. And I think that's a great shame, because, you know, she is good, and these do have some great ideas in them. However, the execution, I feel, is uneven. I just want to talk about the first 2 books in the series, which I think are excellent. This is Planet 4, which I read back in about 2017. This is the first. This is the rock edition, the American edition, which is a trade paperback that's slightly bigger than a B format. I'll show it to you against a Golax. There you go. You see slight difference in size. And I read this back at the time and really enjoyed it. And the basic idea of the Planet 4 novels is that you have near-future dystopian situation, authoritarianism has risen again, people aren't really free anymore, and it's probably set around about to the 2040s, 2050s, that sort of period, and a lot of people have debts and they pretty much become indentured slaves. And against this sort of rather dystopian background, this religious leader called the Pathfinder, who's sort of an Eastern mystic type figure, has risen up. And the Pathfinder has raised money and sort of got some tech going, and builds this spaceship called Atlas, which is going to take her followers to another world, to a sort of Goldilocks zone type planet, and settle it. And, you know, they're going to practice religion there. And the first person narrator, this is a woman, and really fantastic stuff. And this woman has a secret which is gradually revealed, and Emma's very good at dealing with issues of mental health. And the only person I'd seen do anything like this before in a book was Philip K. Dick. The secret the narrator has is around mental health. I'm not going to tell you what it is. It's quite a common complaint, and it's something that really struck me as unusual and clever in an SF novel. It was really, really good. It really grounded it, because there's some way out stuff in here as well, of course. And I'd seen Philip K. Dick do this in Clans of the Alpine Moon. There's aspects, I guess, of it in Philip K. Dick's Martian Timeslip, which has an autistic character. And Emma says she's come out and that she's been, diagnosed with being on the spectrum, which is interesting. I have met, I did an event with her. She's a very nice lady. So, so this is really, really good. And the sequel, After Atlas, the second one, which I think is really excellent, and I read this at the time as well. And a little while ago, I was watching Media Death Cult, and Moyd there did a interview with Adrian Tchaikovsky, and Adrian Tchaikovsky talked about how this is one of the best SF novels of recent years, and I completely agree. I was really impressed with it. And this is sort of a detective story with one of the characters in this dystopian future who's indentured. He's basically a slave to this corporation, and he has this fantastic sort of detective ability, and is set in the southwest of England. It's kind of a locked room mystery story. There are ties to Planetfall. That's the beauty of these. They're not true singletons. They are a series, but they interlink in a common background, and there are some crossovers with characters. But this is absolutely fantastic. So I really enjoyed those. I was quite disappointed when I read Before Mars, the third in the series, which I read some time afterwards and didn't grab me in quite the same way. And the story was okay. I was suffering from Ares syndrome, which is reading too many books set on Mars, because there's a real sort of swathe of them around about the time that Andy Weir's The Martian came out. The less said about that, the better. And I just felt that Emma wasn't writing as well, and I felt the same thing about Atlas Alone. This returns to two of the major characters of the second volume, After Atlas, and I'm not going to talk too much about the plot. It's got sort of a Deus Ex Machina thing in it around AI, which I think is a real problem, because the thing with AI, they so easily become sort of a mouthpiece for what the authors want to put across, and it's very transparent sometimes and too obvious, and I really don't like it. And of course it's literal as well. I guess it's postmodern AI, Deus Ex Machina, the god in the machine, and often it's too easy for a writer to speak their concerns through an AI. I think I like things to be a little bit subtler than that, but it's okay. I did not enjoy it. There's a lot about gaming in it. I'm not really a gaming person. I find it quite dull. I know Emma likes gaming. If you like gaming, it'll probably turn you on. And I didn't feel this and Before Mars were anywhere near as good as Planetfall and After Atlas, but I'm glad I finished it at last. I sort of got round to it. It had been preying on my mind, and it is a shame on a website where she says there isn't the sort of support for another book in the series. I would like one day for her to go back and revise the third and fourth books, because I think she could make them better. They could be shorter, tauter, but they could also be smoother in terms of her style and the depth of her writing, because the depth of her sort of characterization and the way she deals with people comes out really, really well in the first two books in the series, not so much in the second two. So that's Atlas Alone. So I would urge you, if you haven't read Emma's work, do read Planetfall and After Atlas. In theory, you could read them as singletons. You could read this before Planetfall. It is a better book. I would say you probably get just as much of reading the two together, and they're both excellent, so do read them. The other two, not so much. Someone I've been meaning to read for quite some time, and I think this is her fourth book. I think there's two other novels in a short story collection. There's also a non-fiction book about fungi, because she's a scientist, is Aliya Whiteley. This is Skyward Inn. This was a hardcover last year. I bought this probably just over a year ago, hadn't got round to it. It was shortlisted for the Arthur C. Clarke Award. It didn't win. A lot of people felt it should have. In my opinion, usually the book which should win, the Arthur C. Clarke doesn't. It's a bit like the Booker Prize. Happens a lot. And it's very handsome. It's got really great sort of psychedelic type jacket, and if I take that off underneath, you've got this nice decorated boards with these sort of greenish yellow spots on purple background. Very, very handsome, and it's got lots of sort of endorsements on it from people I think are really good. It says Adam Neville, I know Tom Toner likes. I think Adam Neville writes really well as well. Nina Allen, who's a friend of mine, I think writes really well. Adrian Tchaikovsky, all think it's really good. The basic idea of this is about two people, one human and one alien. The alien is called a Kefan, that's with a Q, and they live in an inn, in a pub, in a future protectorate in Devon, and Devon and that part of England is cut off from the rest, and it's sort of still rural, and they haven't modernised, and that's a deliberate thing. And there's been a war between humans and the Queefans, and basically when it comes down to it, the Queefans just seem to stand down. But there's more to it than that, and in this pub they serve up this drink called the brew. There is sort of love between the female human character and the male alien character, but it's not sort of consummated sexually or anything of that kind. It's written really, really well. There's a beautifully drawn character called Foss, who is the estranged son of the woman at Skyward Inn, and it's just very, very beautifully written. It has sort of like a subtle feel of Eastern mysticism to me, and it is good. It's not front rank. I am going to keep an eye on her. I think she will do better work. In terms of his themes and subject matter, I was reminded of several things. There's some quite sort of traditional old SF themes in this. I thought of Exiles on Asperus by John Wyndham, a story from the 1930s, which I think of a lot, which I think is more influential than people seem to really realise. I thought of Childhood's End, of The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. A few others. I made some notes on my phone here. Blood Music by Greg Bear loomed large as well. The late 80s SF exploitation film Society came to mind too as well. And even though this is set in Devon, again, there's a poor visual sense. It's mentioned that it's rural, but there aren't these sort of physical descriptions. You don't get that Hardy-esque quality that could have been in this. It's there in the tone. The tone is there in the prose, but the actual description of the physicality of the place and the characters and that, I felt was far weaker than it should have been. I wanted something that felt more like, say, Michael G. Coney or Keith Roberts. Michael Coney set a lot of SF in sort of seaside places, and obviously Devon, not everywhere in Devon is by the sea, but there's a certain sort of pastoral feel and an invocation of that area of the British countryside, which was lacking from this, even though it was set there, and I was quite disappointed with that, and I wanted to see more of that sort of tradition returning, really. So it's not visual. The characters are really good. Would I hang on to it? I think with all the books I'm going to show you today, they will all be sold on, with the exception of the final book in my pile. But I would say do give this a try. It is good. I think she'll do great things. I'm tempted to read her other books. The writing was good. I don't feel the themes went as far as they could have. There is some talk about this having some sort of body horror element, which I guess is true, but again, visually it wasn't put across. I think it tried almost too hard to be wise in a way, and I'm not entirely sure I was convinced by his messages. Maybe I'm making assumptions what the messages are about unity and peace and freedom and togetherness and what have you. And all those themes come up a lot in the last book I'm going to review today, the one by Adam Roberts, which was The Cream of the Crop. So the best book I've read recently by a long way is Adam Roberts' The This, which came out a couple of months ago from Gollancz hardcover. And so far, this has very, very much been the science fiction novel of 2022 for me. I can say without any doubt whatsoever. And it's sort of marketed and presented as if it's a mere social media novel. It presents this as a social network that people join, and it keeps it in the jacket, but it's not a cult, and and you'll never be alone again and what have you. So you get the impression from the packaging that it's very, very much about how people join this this social media circle, and it feels like a cult to the outside world and so on. So you expect something rather like Chris Beckett's America City, about the whisper stream, which is a kind of Trumpian Twitter type thing. Great as that book is, this is really quite something, because it's actually much more beyond that. This is a philosophical SF novel, and it's absolutely stunning, and I urge you to buy it right now if you like advanced reading in the genre. So the plot, I try not to give spoilers, but it's not really that sort of book. It's a novel of ideas in the purest sense, and there's several sections, and it begins with this very disorienting introductory section, which goes into the idea of the bardo. If you know what the bardo is, look that up. It's a sort of Tibetan Buddhist idea, and it's very, very much the case that it's about reincarnation and spirit, and you get the impression of this character who is being reincarnated in slightly different sort of roles gradually, and the whole Buddhist idea of sort of eternal recurrence within that. And it does sort of invoke the kind of virtual reality sort of things that we've seen in novels going back as far as Christopher Priest's Dream of Wessex, of some of the cyberpunk books and what have you. And then it goes into a narrative about a writer called Richard in the near future, who has quite a sad life. He's lonely a lot. He spends a lot of time on his own. He has too much screen time, as we all do. He drinks too much. He is probably sort of his early to mid 30s, late 20s. And he does writing for all sorts of websites and what have you. And he keeps getting invited to join this social media, except it's more than social media, because you have to have an implant put into the roof of your mouth, which is done with an injection. And this sort of section is really, really good. It reminded me a lot of M. John Harrison, and the way that M. John is very good at sort of depicting the small details of life in that sort of Alan Bennett-esque matter, except of course that, you know, both M. John and Adam are much better writers than Alan Bennett for all his popularity. So yeah, that sort of really sort of grounds it, even though it's near future. And then there's a dizzying section which goes on to the members of this itself, who have this plan to terraform Venus, because you can see there's a conflict building between people in this and the rest of humanity. And that's done in a very sort of stunning hard SF way, and it's done, instead of like pages and pages and pages of sort of dull exposition, it's done in a really sort of sharp, sort of flavoursome, incisive manner. The way, because Adam, of course, is a real writer, you know, he's a really good facility with words, and he sort of picks and chooses. And the method that is used to terraform Venus reminded me, I started thinking of Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut, and especially the end of Cat's Cradle. And there's a direct reference to Cat's Cradle later in the book. And this is a book which is full of literary allusions and illusions as well. And, you know, it's eloquent, there's no fat on it, it's not dull in the typical sort of leaden prose that you get in a lot of hard SF, because a lot of the hard SF writers, they're great at science, but they aren't always sort of very literary, as it were. So that's a fantastic section. So ultimately Richard is approached to ask whether he will join this and infiltrate them and see if he can sort of act as like a fifth column from within. And, you know, he sort of avoided the need to connect, to not be lonely, to reach some sort of oneness. And of course, this is a monad, a singular idea, a singular oneness. And this is a Hegelian novel, and this is the whole point. This is where the book is a kind of companion to Adam's previous work from about 2017-18, The Thing Itself, which was issued here as a trade paperback original, or I should say a B format paperback original. There was no hardcover of this. Adam's first novel not to appear in hardcover, and that was a major, major fail by Gollancz. I personally think this is one of the most important science fiction novels this century, and I talk about it in my top 5 contemporary SF reads, and it's really quite fantastic. And this is sort of Kantian SF. This is about Kant's idea of the thing itself. And, you know, if you want to know more about that, you know, this isn't a philosophy channel, you can look it up, but I'd say read the books and read a little bit about them. Get something like, you know, Philosophy, the Basics or something, and get into these ideas, because they are fascinating and they're not used enough in SF. Not directly, anyway, Adam does them directly here. So it's kind of a companion to that, because Hegel, of course, came after Kant in, you know, sort of the growth of the human sciences. And so, yeah, so a Hegelian novel, it engages the dialectic, and the sort of discussion between two different poles. And for Hegel, this was antithesis and thesis. And if you get the antithesis and the thesis, the two things to disagree, bring them together into a synthesis, that causes new antithesis, new thesis. And the process goes on and on and on until you get the ideal, because, you know, Hegel was an idealist philosopher. And that's what this is. It's an ideal where everybody comes together in a spirit and a zeitgeist, because of course it's about the spirit of our age, where social media is supposed to bring us together, and of course often makes us feel, you know, even more lonely we already are. And this is what Richard, the focus character, sort of seems to be experiencing, and what he wants to avoid. He seems to realize that it's not good for him. So that's sort of part of it. So but it's not just a novel of ideas. It's a very witty and illusory one. As I say, there's allusions to the Smiths, you know, there's lots of poetry, because Adam teaches 19th century literature at Royal Holloway in London. And if you know your Milton and your Coleridge, especially Coleridge, you know, especially Kubla Khan, you know, you get an awful lot out of this. And if you haven't, then read some poetry, you know, because science fiction doesn't exist in a vacuum as literature. For it to be really good, it needs to engage with the rest of literature, like it did in the days of Wells and Orwell and what have you, and people outside the pulp magazine genre SF tradition. It's worth remembering the people like Jack Williamson, even somebody who invented pulp SF, you know, one of the primary people, taught English literature and understood it. So, you know, you do have to look beyond the genre confines. Adam did a TED talk once, which sort of combined science fiction to poetry, and I don't think it's one of his best talks, but to me it was obvious. But he talks about how science fiction is more like poetry than it is like anything else, and it's the vision of the sublime and the poetry of spaceships and the tropes and all the imagery that you associate with SF, as well as the ideas. And you know, it's particular relationship to romantic poetry, the sublime, which is the awe and terror of nature, the beauty of nature. And we can look at this on a cosmic scale. I mean, space, for example, is one of the most sublime things. In this, there's also a future war section, which reminded me of the Forever War, but kind of filtered through Ken MacLeod's Corporation Wars. And it's interesting because the character in that is quite dumb, you know, and it shows a future where people are sort of literally in love with their phones, and obviously it's metaphoric of where we are now. This character's a bit of an idiot savant. And there's a very clever bit of conceptual breakthrough where something's been seeded and it's flipped on its head, you know, expectations are turned upside down. And, you know, and he does this really well, and this should be in every good SF novel. Interestingly, early in the review, I talked to Emma Newman and the Atlas book, and she does that towards the end, but not very, very well. If you want to read a really good example of how Emma uses it, but when somebody does it in a much more fleet and clever and, you know, really revelatory way, read Frederick Pohl's Man Plus, is what I say, which is an amazing novel. This is sort of multifaceted and multi-layered, and there's an amazing section which is set post Winston Smith in the world of 1984. It's complete with Newspeak and the Thought Police and the Ministry of Love. And, you know, Adam completely understands Newspeak as being the thing which sort of underlines the dystopia of 1984. And there's a character in it called Blair, who, of course, George Orwell's real name was Eric Blair. So, you know, and that's in there. Orwell recognised the totalitarian in himself, and you know, he says that's why he was so sort of able to create this amazing dystopian world of 1984. So this is a real bravura performance. It's a companion to the candy and delights of the thing itself. It's just absolute dizzying, you know. It's wonderful stuff, and the writing is beautiful, and it doesn't stand still. You don't get bored with it. It's not too long. Really, really great stuff. This is science fiction as literature, and you know, Adam is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and rightly so. And interestingly, there's a sort of a quote by Christopher Priest on the back. It says "smart and ingenious writer," and also the acknowledgements. Adam thanks Chris. So obviously, Chris has gone from his early position many years ago. I remember reading a review of The Snow, which is, think about, Adam's fourth or fifth book, where, you know, Chris really sort of ripped into him about sort of the logic of the story and what have you, and some of the tropes. But now obviously Chris is fully on board, and obviously they've sort of interacted and what have you. And that's typical of Chris. You know, he wants to see writers get better and be better, and you know, he sets a standard as far as I'm concerned. So yes, so this one of Adam's finest novels, and certainly the finest new SF novel I've read this year. Just a few more words to close about the importance of quality writing in science fiction, as in anything else. I want to go back to the Midwich Cuckoos briefly. I did the video the other day, and you know, since then I've looked even more at what the makers of the new TV series have said, and there's various interviews with various creatives and what have you, and you know, it astonishes me how much they miss some of the obvious implications of the story and some of their justifications for changing it and what have you. It's just silly, and everything that they sort of seem to think they need to foreground is in the book. And just to sort of talk about subtlety and close reading, I mean, with the Midwich Cuckoos particularly, I rewatched Village of the Damned, and the more I watch it, the less enamoured I grow. I think it has lots of flaws and edit problems and what have you. It's still great fun to watch, and that reminded me of this film, These Are the Damned, which is a Hammer film directed by Joseph Losey. I think might have still been blacklisted in the States for being a communist, and it's also known as The Damned, and it's got Oliver Reed looking very handsome there. And this is a very interesting film because it's sort of, it's got the sort of structure of a conventional sort of existential drama, but it's got this science fiction conceit based on this novel called The Children of Light, which I've not read, which is quite obscure. And this is actually more like Children of the Damned, the sequel supposedly to Village of the Damned, which also gets it wrong because of course the children in that have different ethnicities, and of course as we said in the video, you know, the whole point of the Midwich Cuckoos is they're clones, they're physically identical, they're not individuals, they're two individuals, one of each gender. But this is really good. If you haven't seen this, it's filmed in Weymouth. It makes great use of outdoor shooting. It's got all sorts of strange subplots. But I would say do watch this if you've not seen it. But as I say, none of this is canon. The only thing that's canon is the book. The point I wanted to make about the book, and in terms of the quality of the writing, because I've just reread it, in terms of what I've said about Adam Roberts, is illusions and what have you. And the final chapter of the book, of course, is called Celebi of Macedon. Gordon Celebi, who works out that, you know, the only way to sort of deal with the children is they have to be killed, and it has to be done in a manner of subterfuge. And, you know, the book is about the ethical arguments about what's right to do in a survival situation, you know. And Celebi's final words in a letter left for his wife, effectively a suicide note, says, you know, in Latin, when in Rome, you know, do as the Romans do. But he also says, you know, if you're going to live in the jungle, you have to live as the jungle does. Why is the last chapter called Celebi of Macedon? Well, of course, Alexander the Great was Macedonian emperor. And there's the whole thing of the Gordian knot, you know, and he cut the Gordian knot with, you know, he looked at it, and there's different sort of accounts of how the Gordian knot, which is very difficult to untangle, and whoever untangled it would become king, you know, and Alexander obviously went on to sort of rule most of the known world at that time. And of course, he just sort of cut through it with his sword. It doesn't matter how you undo it, you just do it. And he did it. And that's what Celebi does, of course. The Celebi of Macedon is likening Celebi to Alexander the Great, great saviour, you know, of sort of humankind in this case, as it were. And of course, Gordian and Gordon Celebi is a pun, you know. So this is the sort of thing, you know, and writers don't do these things for no reason. And good writers will often put stuff like that in that relates to wider culture. There's the meaning and the beauty of words. And that's what was there in Adam Roberts' book, which I didn't find in Scalzi's book. I didn't find in Emma Newman's book. And, you know, and I didn't really find it in Aliya Whiteley, though, you know, I may be wrong there might be some things I missed, but certainly Aliya Whiteley was the best one after Adams. So, you know, when you're close reading a text and you see these things, look them up. You know, there are Latin tags throughout Wyndham, which is, you know, you could say is pretentious. We didn't all have a classical education, but, you know, education is education. The devil's in the details, so do look them up. So that's a final thought. This is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now, reading some old books next time.